the life that we live is very often defined by love. The people we care for and the effect they have on us are often intrinsic to who we are today. You yourself are likely the very product of that same concept. I can't speak for your conception obviously, but I'd be willing to bet money that a great many of you were made because of the passion that two people harbour for each other and the want to share that with the world. The love of a life is something precious to us. The person who completes you, who brings out the good in you and understands you for who you truly are. Whether they're platonic or romantic, they are the person who, out of everyone on this earth, creates you. You are a product of them. Maybe not in your entirety, but who they are has changed you on an intrinsic level, a level that I want to explore today. I think it can be very plainly seen that in most media, romances and rom-coms are, and always have been, some of the most popular genres in storytelling. Even completely unrelated genres almost always include some kind of romantic plotline to hook readers, whether it be integral or inconsequential to the main plot. The romance between the prevalent characters in the story can be the emotional heartbeat of the tale being told by the author. To drop something so simple out of the story would create worlds that are entirely different and franchises that have almost completely different meanings to their intended design. The life that love breathes into stories is something that cannot be replicated without love, or even with a pale imitation of it. It needs to feel real and earned. It needs to feel true, or else the audience will see the cracks in the fourth wall. Pride and Prejudice is, in a sense, the beginning of a huge quantity of the romantic tropes we see in modern romance books. Things like enemies to lovers, class difference, brooding boy, and even a hint of manic pixie dream girl can all be found within the fairy tale-like setting of early 19th century Meryton, Hertfordshire. And while this book may not have been the beginning of these tropes, most if not all of them originate somewhere in some ancient folklore, it certainly sent their popularity through the roof. Pride and Prejudice was very popular, even during its time, with the novel selling out its first edition back in 1813, and with even more editions released in the same year. Elizabeth Bennet, as the plot details, is a relatively poor girl when compared to her peers. She's a smart, suave lady, the second oldest of her 5 sisters, and someone who, despite her age, has not married yet. However, the trajectory of her life suddenly changes when the wealthy Charles Bingley suddenly moves into the nearby Netherfield mansion. And the moment that the mothers in the nearby town of Meryton get wind that a wealthy bachelor has moved in, they race to action in order to facilitate their daughter's new potential marriages. Now, coming from a 21st century perspective, you might be wondering, what's all the hullabaloo about? Well, to quote one of the most famous lines in fiction, "It is a truth universally acknowledged that a single man in possession of a good fortune must be in want of a wife." This line, the very first line in the novel, is a great taster for the style and themes of the rest of the book. You know exactly what you're getting into and what kind of setting this is with that line. What it is essentially stating is that whether the feelings of the man in question are taken into account, the single daughters of the time were expected to do their best to marry the eligible bachelor in order to secure a life for themselves. That is the societal norm of the time, and that is where we find ourselves at the beginning of the book. This is why when Elizabeth first meets Mr. Bingley's friend Fitzwilliam Darcy, she's a touch intrigued by him. That is until he calls her not especially handsome, and her hope for a tall, dark and brooding man is squashed by the hurt of her pride. For Elizabeth, this was the deciding factor in making him the most undesirable man on the planet. However, while this was all going on, Elizabeth's older sister Jane Bennet was getting asked to dance twice by the happier and go-luckier but still quite handsome Mr. Bingley. He seemed to take quite a liking to Jane at the ball that he hosted and intends to host another one sometime soon. Throughout the course of the novel following these events, Bingley, Jane, Elizabeth and Darcy keep managing to spend time with each other, especially when Jane falls ill at Bingley's large Netherfield manor, much to the dismay of Lizzie. The events that our protagonists undergo ultimately only serve to demonstrate to her that while Jane and Bingley are a wonderful match, her and Darcy could only ever be rivals. This all comes to a major head when, upon being invited to Rosings Manor by her distant relative Mr. Collins, she is shocked to realise that the owner of the property, Miss Catherine de Bourgh, is the aunt of one Fitzwilliam Darcy. Darcy and Elizabeth spend their time at Rosings attempting to one-up each other and, somehow, becoming closer in the process. Mr. Darcy, upon realising his feelings for this witty and intelligent woman, proposes. This comes as an incredible shock to Elizabeth because Mr. Darcy was the last person in the world whom she could be prevailed upon to marry. She cites his arrogance, his pride, and his selfish disdain as reasons for not wanting to be with him. However, along with that, she also cites the fact that he had a major role to play in driving Jane and Bingley apart. This isn't enough for Elizabeth yet though, and the last trick she has up her sleeve is the mistreatment of one Mr. Wickham. You see, Elizabeth had been conversing with and falling for this man, a member of the militia that had recently come into town, who went on to tell her how Darcy cheated him out of a house and inheritance. She brings this up to Darcy in their argument, and Darcy, with anger but no answer, leaves Elizabeth alone. This entire sequence was designed to end with the gigantic failure of Darcy's Everything I've built up with the plot, everything I've detailed up until now has been all for this. And it created a situation that we as readers were both shocked by and incredibly intrigued by. Now, if you haven't read the book, please give it a shot. It is so good. The events are jaw-dropping and it feels like a fairy tale, I promise. Just give it a go. Now, I want you to listen very carefully to what I'm about to tell you next, because in my opinion, this chapter that comes after this is the most jaw-dropping chapter I've ever read in anything. It forces you to sit with Elizabeth and come to the same realizations as her at the same time as her. The next chapter, Elizabeth is walking in the Garden of Rosings in order to avoid Mr. Darcy, when all of a sudden, he appears at a nearby gate. He hands her a letter and asks her to read it so he may explain himself. He then bids her farewell and leaves. With her curiosity getting the better of her, she opens it and reads. This letter, the world-shattering midpoint of the book, details how Mr. Darcy viewed the events she described. To be brief about what is an incredible chapter, entirely comprised of this letter, Mr. Darcy cites that he did not wish his friend to marry into a family that held themselves with such a lack of composure and so openly theorized that their sister would be married by the end of the month to Mr. Bingley, both at the Netherfield Ball and elsewhere. This takes both Elizabeth and the reader aback. We hadn't even thought to question these characters that we've been following up until now because they were our point of view characters. To us, their world was the world. There was no other perspective we could have been following. This world and its manners that we modern readers are unfamiliar with were being shown to us by what are essentially unreliable narrators, not the average family. Elizabeth's heart sinks as she considers this prospect, but she moves on. Next, Darcy details the truth between him and Mr. Wickham, not the lies that Mr. Wickham had been spreading across the town. In short, Mr. Wickham was a childhood friend of Mr. Darcy's, and some of the inheritance that the Fitzwilliam family left was in Wickham's name. Wickham was delighted by this, and promptly proceeded to squander this money under the guise of studying law. Darcy found this out when Wickham came begging back for more money, promising to do it right this time. But Darcy did not give in, and Wickham left. Later, Wickham would work with a personal tutor to coerce Darcy's younger sister, whom Darcy dearly loves, into marrying him and eloping, hoping for her inheritance. Darcy caught wind of this last second and covered it up for his sister's sake, and Wickham went off to the militia in order to make a living. Now Elizabeth has to reckon not only with the man she loved being a horrible person, but also the fact that her family had been causing problems up to this point so large that it has driven Jane and Bingley apart. In this moment, our whole view of the world is flipped upside down as themes of pride and prejudice become way more clear. And we realise just how naive Miss Eliza Bennet had actually been this whole time. And now the reason I've basically just done a review of the book up until this point is because I need you to understand the plot of the book so you can understand just how much it affects the modern romance genre. And to do that, I think you need to know the ending. After leaving Rosings, Elizabeth's mind is getting the better of her. She begins to reconsider Darcy's status as the worst man she's ever met, and, unable to see him for so long, begins to feel for him. After many more chapters wrapping up what the story set up, Mr. Bingley returns alongside Darcy. You see, Mr. Darcy had realised what he had done to poor Jane and decided to convince Bingley to return in order to follow his heart and propose. When Elizabeth walked in on them discussing their potential future together, my jaw was on the floor in this moment, because if you read the book, you have basically no choice but to root for these two the entire time, and so when they get together, it is the perfect ending for each of them. But that's not the end. Darcy, unable to control his feelings for a second time, this time without reserves about Elizabeth's family or her social status, proposes. Despite the heavy objections and even threats from Darcy's aunt, Lady Catherine de Bourgh, Elizabeth announces that she would not deny his proposal and she agrees to marry him. And when they walk through the garden asking each other when they fell in love, it almost felt childishly gleeful. This fairy tale ending is why Pride and Prejudice has become the classic that it is. The fact that no problem was too large to overcome and nothing went incredibly wrong while still holding a healthy amount of mishaps and mess-ups creates a tale with a feel-good narrative that has you craving your very own fairy tale ending for the rest of your life. You listen to music, you know how heavily it can affect not only our emotions but also our logical minds. The music that we listen to really informs how we see the day and how we experience our lives. I personally love to listen to really happy and upbeat music because I really like the joyful feelings it inspires within me. But that's not to say I hate slow songs either, because I have plenty of slow songs I love too. What music do you like? How does it help you see the day? A lot of couples seem to have their song. It could be a song that perfectly encapsulates their relationship, a song that they both learned of together, a song that was playing during an emotional moment for them, or simply a song that they both love. Music is instrumental in not only our already established relationships, but the new relationships that we form as well. Have you ever been crushing on someone and you find yourself listening to Bruno Mars in order to process those feelings of attraction? Or maybe your heart is just shattered into pieces and you realize that all of a sudden you've been listening to Mr. Brightside in a state of both anger and sadness? No? Too basic? The music that we choose to listen to is not only a reaction to those feelings that we are currently experiencing, but a way to set up and make ourselves feel the way we want to feel in that moment. And so, if you're thinking of someone when you listen to your favorite love song, just realize exactly what you're doing to yourself.
Music itself seems to be dominated by feelings of love and loss. Now, even as a child, I could recognize that on the radio you couldn't go 3 songs without hearing a song that someone made in response to another person's romantic feelings. Now, while I am a complete dunce when it comes to music, I know nothing about music theory, I'm a human. And you're probably also a human. And so I think we can probably relate our experiences quite well on the topic.
And that seems to be the fundamental foundation of the love found in music, from my perspective anyway. The music filled with vague descriptions and widely palatable feelings has become, and probably always was, the greatest force in the industry. You know how people can perform superhuman feats when they realize someone they love is in danger, lifting cars and such? Well, it also seems to be the driving factor pushing a lot of people to make the music that they make. Entire albums are dedicated to this one decisive human element. People just started out are pushed to make songs about the love or loss that they are currently feeling, because music is not only a way to distract them from their current issues, but also a way to help them process the emotions they are currently feeling.
Lovesick by the Happy Fits is a newly released album that marks their return to music after a 3-year hiatus. This album seems hellbent on blurring the lines between where the feelings of love start and end, with the first 4 songs, Do You See Me, Everything You Do, Cruel Power, and Lovesick No. 1 Misery being slow, wistful and yearning songs that really seem to detail how this main character is falling for their crush, but their love is not being reciprocated at all, with the main character's love interest still keeping the main character around despite that, just for their own amusement.
I really love this album, not just because of my music taste in general, but because I feel like it truly encapsulates what many different emotions can be when you're in love. It is something incredibly fun to listen to, and I'd recommend you give it a go. For the sake of keeping this analysis reasonably easy to follow, I'm going to refer to the main character as Calvin, as he's both the lead singer in most of the songs, and his name comes up in song 13. And the crush in question is going to be Sarah because of the name Sarah's Song. Pretty simple.
Do You See Me is a slow love ballad that starts out quiet and gets louder and louder to the point of almost shouting. The lyrics Calvin sings talk about reading self-help books in Your Voice and wanting Sarah to just see him.
He goes on to question where and when he fell in love, with the background singers talking about new realizations about Sarah, such as she likes yellow. In the end, we get a slow instrumental that leads us nicely into what is my personal favourite song from this album, Everything You Do. Beginning with an excited
This song bursts onto the scene with an incredibly upbeat tone, talking about how Calvin can't get his mind off of Sarah and how he is just falling endlessly in love with her. But he is still living his life up to this point. He needs to pay bills and he's becoming increasingly moody because of his love for Sarah.
Sarah is becoming his entire world, as he realizes just how much he's fallen and just how much of a headless feeling she's given him. Raina's verse repeats what the song has been saying up until now, but focusing more on the lyrics, the realization, than the music and emotions. This ends with a huge crescendo where Calvin is seemingly begging into the void for Sarah to say she loves him too.
The next song, Cruel Power, starts with the line, "Get out of my head." Calvin at this point knows that he loves Sarah, but he can't do anything about it due to the fact that she has a boyfriend.
He is misinterpreting her friendliness as romantic hints, and it is driving him up the wall, asking if she wants his love. Something interesting in this song, however, is that when Nico and Raina begin singing, it seems to be from Sarah's perspective, and it looks like she knows about Calvin's crush but is pretending to be oblivious.
She likes his friendship and how helpful he is to her, but that is just that. She is so happy that they can be friends and wants nothing more. The last song of the first 4, Lovesick, is the first one where Calvin really starts to get frustrated with Sarah's endless game of cat and mouse and starts to realize that maybe he's a little bit angry at her.
He has resigned himself to waiting out this goddamn storm while God and Cupid watch him. He admits to wanting to live forever in her kiss and is getting more annoyed that he cannot. The second half of the song morphs into a tune that is no longer slow and melodic, but rushed and more screamy. This is Calvin's declaration that while he loves Sarah, she doesn't love him because she doesn't need him, and that is alright with him. Moving into section 2.
The Nerve is an angry, chaotic soundtrack that seems to be both a self-deprecating piece about the past and a hype-yourself-up track about the mistakes that Calvin has made and won't make again. If I had to guess where a confession happened between Calvin and Sarah, I would guess in between this song and the last one. It seems to me that The Nerve is a reactionary piece following the rejection that Calvin received from Sarah.
He had the nerve and it made him look like a piece of shit,
Miss You looks like it's taking place a short time after The Nerve, where Calvin is reminiscing on his time as just a friend of Sarah's before he had the nerve to admit his love and they began drifting apart. He will miss her, even if it's the last thing that he does. He believes that this is his final time with her as their relationship is strained, wishing that they could just get in the car and let it take them away. I Could Stare at You for Hours is the slowest song that this album has to offer. It also has the most traditionally romantic sound, with the single guitar strumming a slow tune behind Calvin singing. It almost feels as if this song is meant to be Calvin releasing his thoughts in the form of a song in world. Just like Do You See Me, the strings slowly build to 3 crescendos of emotion, with each crescendo rapidly devolving, perhaps as an allegory for the tears that might be running down his cheeks. At this point, Calvin and Sarah's relationship seems to be back on track. The lyrics note that she keeps coming over, but he now has to come to terms with the fact that he can never have her despite how much he could stare at her for hours. Sarah's song, despite the name, isn't a song about Sarah herself, but the process of healing after her rejection. Calvin asks, "How should I know how I feel today?" possibly as a response to someone asking him how he's holding up. The advice of "You can't have a rainbow without a little rain" plays, with the choir creating an uplifting backing track, possibly to represent Calvin finally giving himself the time to heal while recognizing the pain that he's dealing with. Shake Me is a very clear relapse of Calvin's to his old ideas. Unable to cast off the love he has for Sarah, this song begins by asking the question, how did we get so dull? Taking place in the living room while the two are watching the show The Office with an air that is both boring and plain. Calvin is slowly retreating back into his mind as the music gets louder and more chaotic, asking Sarah to wrap her hands around his neck in a loving or potentially playful embrace and shake him, wanting anything except this grey and boring time spent together. I Still Think I Love You is a reflection of everything that Sarah and Calvin have done to each other, while Calvin still recognizes the place that Sarah has in his heart. Calvin is mad at all the dumb shit that he said, but he still loves Sarah, even though he has suspicions about and decisions to make regarding her actions. If you remember, back in Cruel Power, the song seemed to create an image of Sarah leading Calvin on just a slight bit. And while it could be very much interpreted as Calvin digging too deep into her thoughts, this song brings back the idea that maybe she enjoyed the attention she was getting and intentionally kept him around and kept him wanting. And Calvin is finally starting to recognize that. He's holding some tied up aggravation for Sarah inside of himself while still knowing that he loves her. The final song in this unofficial middle section is Wild in Love, with the verses sang by the much deeper Luke and the chorus by the usual Calvin. It seems to be a juxtaposition between the doubt that the character of Calvin has about his relationship with Sarah, questioning and regretting his decisions and feelings, and falling into the unbridled emotions that still reside in him when the chorus hits. The tune talks about wanting to run for miles and miles with Sarah, being utterly and completely and wildly in love with her. He knows in his head that this isn't right, but in his heart he still feels incredible feelings for her and he can't ignore them. Black Hole is an angry statement piece talking about everything that was wrong with Sarah. He compares her to the and asks her if she's hungry again for his love. Calvin talks about how much he gave her while she didn't even take the time to get to know him. He realizes that she was probably just keeping him around for some attention. He asks her to show him that she is human, finally realizing all that he's been through and how she kept it up despite it obviously hurting him in the long run. This song is the only one in the bunch to be truly hateful, with not an ounce of love for Sarah left in him. Until Superior, where Calvin is reminiscing about their time together, asking why does he dream when he's awake. It's here that he realizes that he didn't really know Sarah either, only the picture-perfect view of her that he had in his head. He is clearly missing that version of her that no longer exists and is wishing that he could hear from that beautiful and intangible version of his crush that he believed was real for so long. He knows now what the right move is, but he cannot bring himself to abandon that character that he created of her in his head. He is calling out from home to what I have to imagine is Lake Superior, where she most likely is. He finally admits to not knowing who she was anyway, and then we come to a very interesting part of the song. In this portion of the song, we finally hear Sarah on the phone in a voice note saying,
Calvin, it's me. You stole everything from me, Calvin, when you took that van, and you didn't even think about it. Calvin, when you left, you took my everything.
This reframes both this song and Black Hole in a huge way. It seems that upon the advent of Black Hole, Calvin packed up his things in a van and left Sarah back in Lake Superior, realizing that he needed some space. Calvin understood finally that he needs to leave her in the past and move on with her not around, as she would always be dragging him along with whatever she did, whether that is as a friend or leading him on as a love interest. And lastly for this song, the voice note crosses us over into the world of Sarah. Wrong About Me is, and I see no way around it, the first song of the album written by the character Sarah. Everything in this song would make no sense to be written from Calvin's perspective, with even the first few lines being that she misses the frown that's worn when you're mad at me. Sarah has never been shown to be mad at Calvin, but Calvin has been shown to be mad at Sarah, and so this song would make a lot more sense if written from Sarah's perspective. Sarah tries to reassure herself that they just need space, and she talks about how she can't blame Calvin for taking his car and driving it forward with rotted memories. With the previous voice note in mind, where Sarah asked Calvin why he took his car and drove far away, it would make no sense for Calvin to be singing this, and so I think it must be Sarah.
Throughout this song, we really get a sense of sadness and regret from Sarah. She calls Calvin love and admits it was wrong to waste both of their time. She admits that she didn't know herself as a child back then when she was messing with him, but she also admits that he watched her fall with ease, probably for other men like her boyfriend back in Cruel Power. And he watched her fall from grace as a person. She finally understands that what she did hurt him. She understands that she was wrong about the person she should have been with, and she notes that he was wrong about her too. Sarah has finally learned too late that she should have been with Calvin instead of just leading him on for years, and she understands that Calvin now knows that his view of her was twisted and that she wasn't who he thought she was. They both messed up, and Sarah is realizing her part in that.
I Remember is the last song in the selection, and I suspect that it is also written by Sarah.
She seems to be wandering through a city, smelling coffee and pushing through the crowds, stating that all of their purposes aren't as good as her purpose, which I will get back to. She admits to yearning for miles, something small like a postcard or antique. She wants to receive something from Calvin because of how much she misses him. Something to note is that she refers to him as my friend, while he only ever referred to her as my love. She, at this point, misses him as a friend, and I imagine this song is her making her way up to see him while she remembers everything that had happened between them. She is using public transport, which is made clear by the child screaming and the shaking seat, but all the while she can only think about how much she misses being with her friend and how much she wants him back. If I could change your memory, I would burn through words I meant to say but could never speak. Sarah has things she wishes she could tell Calvin, for example how sorry she is. She screams that she is a coward, useless, impulsive, off the cuff. She understands that it was ruthless to call him begging him to come back. She now, only way too late, is attempting to keep the friend she pushed away with her antics, and by the lack of any song afterwards, it probably didn't work. Overall, these songs can be left up to a wide range of interpretations. This is just the best I could do with my limited knowledge of the band, their intentions, their lives, etc. If you have anything to say regarding my inferences, I'll be having a look at the comments.
Love doesn't have to be exclusively fictional, however, because whether you've had trouble with love or whether you fancy yourself deeply infatuated with your partner, you have to recognize the hundreds of thousands of love stories that have been told through real people in history. Some of the more famous examples can include Cleopatra and Mark Antony, Josephine Napoleon, Anne Boleyn and King Henry VIII, etc.
The real life story I want to talk about today is one with a bit of a gothic element to it, more of a tale of tragedy than of true love, and yet it remains an ideal example of the love of a life in the real world. Mary Wollstonecraft Shelley is best known for writing the 1816 science fiction story Frankenstein. We won't be talking much about that literary landmark in depth though. Instead, I want to take a look at the life of its author, because while it may not lie in the realm of the supernatural or the fictional, she still has an incredibly interesting life to have lived.
Mary Wollstonecraft Godwin was born and raised in London in 1797. However, her mother died of puerperal fever just 11 days after her birth, leaving her father William Godwin and her older sister Fanny Imlay to raise her.
Mary's mother was one of the leading figures in the feminist movement of the time, with her book, A Vindication on the Rights of Women, being incredibly popular at the time. While Mary's young life was joyful and seemingly only consisted of the usual strife that children have, her father was often very deeply in debt, and so, to help alleviate some of the debt, he found a new wife,
Jane Clairmont, who brought with her two new children, Charles and Claire Clairmont. Remember Claire, she'll be important. Now Mary never really liked this woman, and other people described her as quick-tempered and quarrelsome, but that's neither here nor there in the grand scheme of the story. Together, the family started a publishing firm called M.J. Godwin, which didn't go well.
Godwin was pretty much always in debt, borrowing loans to pay off loans and getting help from his, quote, philosophical devotees.
Now, a lot of people agreed with William Godwin's takes, however, he did also have some haters, and because of his philosophical works, he was able to garner a lot of connections. This meant that he could get Jane and his other children a good education and bring them to some very intellectual places.
Access to the library and the intellectuals who visited him, yada yada, Samuel Taylor, yada yada. Aaron Burr! Through this, Mary got a pretty good education for the time.
She had a governess, a personal tutor, and even went to a boarding school. She would go to stay with a family friend twice, meeting her future man, Percy Bysshe Shelley, in between these 2 visits, and by the end of the second visit, Percy was estranged from his wife and regularly visiting Godwin, agreeing to take him out of his debt. He was quite the fan of Godwin's philosophical takes, particularly his economical views, which came from Godwin's book Political Justice. Percy's wealthy aristocratic family didn't like this though, and therefore he had trouble getting the money he had thought he could have used to pay off Godwin's debts. And when he told Godwin that he either couldn't or wouldn't pay off the debts, Godwin got a little pissy with Percy.
Soon after this, Mary and Percy began secretly meeting up in the graveyard where Mary's mother was buried. And at some point during these meetings, they fell in love. This caused Percy to admit that he had an ardent love for Mary, causing Mary to announce that she had reciprocated feelings. Now, he was 20 and she was 16, which by modern standards, no, very bad, but by the 1800s standards, I don't know what you expect. And then either that day or the next day, depending on what version of the story you believe, Mary lost her virginity to Percy. And if you want to believe the awesome version of the story, this happened in the same graveyard where Mary's mother was buried. When my English teacher first told us the story, she told us that it happened on top of the grave where Mary's mother was buried. However, I couldn't find any sources for that, so we're just going to assume that it happened in the same graveyard, not on top of the same grave.
Mary proclaimed herself attracted to Percy's wild, intellectual, earthly looks, which...
Yeah, no, I can see it.
Now, because he was trying to protect the spotless fame of his daughter, and because Percy had failed to help him, Godwin disapproved of the relationship.
This caused Mary to be quite distraught because to her, Percy was the kind of guy that really embodied her father's ideals, especially the idea that marriage was a repressive monopoly. Remember that idea, that will be important later.
A month later, the couple eloped to France, taking Mary's sister Claire with them. According to some sources that are, namely, not Wikipedia, Claire had been helping Mary and Percy exchange words while Mary and Percy were forbidden from seeing each other. They attempted to reach Switzerland before having to turn back around because of the lack of money and finding out that Mary was pregnant. When they returned, Mary was genuinely shocked that her father wouldn't help her, and despite managing to keep themselves going, Percy did have to leave their home at times to dodge creditors, which caused the pair great distraught.
Percy and Claire often went on long walks together to leave the house. Now, according to Wikipedia, it's almost certain that Percy and Claire were lovers. However, at least Percy and Mary believed in the concept of free love that Mary's father had proposed.
Essentially, polyamory, and not being tied down by marriage. It's implied in her article that she wasn't a fan of this, but I didn't look further into it than that. To complement this, Percy encouraged Mary to get with their friend Thomas Hoggs, but it seems like Mary never really felt like it. Later on in the spring of 1815, Mary gave birth to a premature girl who then died shortly after. She would be plagued by visions of her dead child, but conceived again, and by the summer she was doing pretty alright mentally. Now, onto the bit where she writes Frankenstein.
You see, Claire had been having a little fling with the poet Lord Byron, which left her 6 months pregnant. And so, off the gang went to Geneva, Switzerland, where they all rented places in Cologne near a lake, and the summer was a pretty happy one. Spent boating, talking late into the night, and generally writing a lot.
It was a typically wet and unpleasant summer, but one night, near the fire, the gang were considering German ghost stories, when Byron prompted each of them to write their own ghost stories. This proved a difficult challenge at first for Mary, having not published any novels yet. In her journals, she recalls dreading having to tell the group that she had no ideas every morning.
One evening in mid-June, however, an idea sprang to life when the visitors of Lake Geneva were sitting around a campfire telling German ghost stories, and they began discussing the nature of the principle of life and reanimating the dead. You can probably see where it goes from here. 2 years later, in 1818, Mary Shelley published the work Frankenstein, and years later, people contemplated just how much Percy had played a role in its development. Some people say Percy wrote just the foreword, and some people say he was an important editor and decision maker throughout the process of the book. You pick your side.
In September 1816, Percy, Mary, and Claire moved to Bath, where they hoped to keep Claire's pregnancy a secret.
However, after the suicide of Percy's wife Harriet, the couple opted to adopt the kids, which meant that it was important that they get married and soon. And so they did, with the surprising consent of Mary's father, which ended the family feud. In 1817, Percy was deemed morally unfit to raise the kids by the church, and so he didn't get to keep them. However, Mary did give birth to her third child, Clara, in September.
Since Percy was still being chased by debtors, along with ill health and fear of losing custody of the kids, the family, along with Claire and her new child, moved to Italy in March 1818. Claire's child was handed over to Lord Byron, and the party spent their time travelling to Italy, never settling and making friends that would move with them whenever they went.
During their travels, Mary's 2 children passed away. Both Clara and Percy died of sickness, leaving Mary feeling depressed and isolated from Percy. Over time, the birth of her 4th child did lift her spirits, however, nothing would truly ease the pain of losing 3 children. Throughout their time in Italy, the couple was quite polygamous, with Percy having close relationships with Amelia Viviani, Sophia Stacey, and Jane Williams. And Mary too had a close relationship with Jane, but also with Prince Alexandros Mavrocordatos and Edward Williams. Mary and Percy travelled from place to place, eventually settling down in a little spot in a town named Lerici next to the ocean.
And on the 16th of June, she miscarried, losing so much blood that her life was only saved when Percy decided to place her in a bathtub of ice to stanch the bleeding. This threw Mary into further despair and depression after losing 2 children and miscarrying, but rather than spend time with his depressed and debilitated wife, he opted to spend more time with Jane Williams, and most of his poetry from that time was about her. During the summer, a member of the party, Edward Trelawney, had designed a boat for the men to use during the warm months. Percy regarded this as a perfect plaything and made a trial journey along with Jane's husband, Edward Williams, down to South Livorno. They were set to make the return journey a week later along with their boat boy. However, as the week came, Mary received a letter from their friend Leigh Hunt that was meant for Percy that read, "Pray tell write to us how you got home, for they say you had bad weather after you sailed Monday and we were anxious."
Mary and Jane rushed to Livorno and then to the nearby Pisa, hoping to find their husbands safe and sound, just waiting out the bad storm so that they could make their trip again soon. However, 10 days after the storm, 3 bodies were washed up in between the 2 towns. Percy, Edward, and the boat boy were all dead. While the rest of her life still has plenty of tales to tell, I have covered all I wanted to cover as it relates to love. However, I will give you a brief aftermath of her life as it concerns the topic.
She continued writing, swearing to live by the pen and for her son, Percy Florence. Throughout the rest of her time on Earth, she would have suspected flings with various figures but never any true romance.
She even turned down a man's proposal by saying that after being married to one genius, she could only ever marry another.
She would go on to compile her late husband's works into a collection and even included an uncensored version of his play Queen Mab, despite many of the passages being shocking and atheistic in nature.
Mary would pass away on the 1st of February 1851, and a year later her son and daughter-in-law would open up her box desk to find locks of her children's hair, a notebook she shared with Percy, and a copy of his poem Adonais, and a silk parcel which contained some of his poems folded around his ashes and what remained of his heart, which is incredibly raw if you ask me. I wanted to tell this story because, while it does turn tragic, I think it is an ideal real-world example of how love can push us through life and through our hardships. Mary and Percy went through a lot. Life was tough on them, they struggled, but through the end, they cared for each other right up until they died. And Mary always kept Percy close by, in her desk.
There's one more side of the story of the love of a life that I want to look at. It's something that I think is super important to the way we see love and...
Can I tell a personal story for a minute? Fun fact, the original ending to this video was an apology. You see, back last August, I broke up with my ex-girlfriend of 2 years. To make a long and very personal story short, we were very different people and it simply didn't work out. The original script I wrote spoke about how I was sorry for not being a particularly good boyfriend to her leading up to the end of our relationship, and while I still think an apology is deserved for my not being a very good boyfriend in those last few months, I've had to rewrite the script over and over because I have more to say now. This video has spent a long time in production, not because it actually took almost a year to make, but because I haven't had a lot of time to sit at my desk and edit now that I've started college. But I haven't been riddled with work to do either. You see, the reason this video has taken almost a year to make is because I've been spending time with the people I love, new and old. In the time since I broke up with my ex, I have met incredible new friends, I have formed deeper bonds with my old ones, I have had new romantic interests, and I've fallen in love with someone new. My new partner's awesome. They're super smart, kind, funny, stunning, you name it. And while I love them to the ends of the earth and back, this section isn't completely about them. You see, I've had a long time to mull over the idea of the love of a life. And at one time, I attached it to romantic love, but now I think it has evolved beyond that for me. Sometimes, when I'm walking home from a fun day of seeing my friends, I think about how much I enjoyed being there with them, and it genuinely feels like I'm about to burst with joy. These people, who I do not see romantically, have made my days feel so full and entertaining, and I cannot thank them enough. I know that without them, I would be a completely different person, and it is in these times that I think I came to the conclusion that the love of a life is not just romantic. It can never be just romantic, because while your partner may be the closest person to you and change you in ways you didn't know possible, so too can the people who love you platonically and who you love right back. When you say you love someone, romantically or not, it is proof that they have changed you, that they have given you at least one experience that has informed who you are today. Your life would be fundamentally different without the love of everyone around you, which is why the loves of my life are, I think, everyone who has changed me. Some more than others, of course, but I would not be the same person without everyone I know and care about by my side. Thank you guys. Keep making friends, keep meeting family, keep falling in love, because even if you don't think you have a love of your life right now, someone will come along and change you for the better.